see that opening slide then?
Yeah.
Yes, yep.
Jolly good. Okay, right. I've got this evening, well, I don't know whether it's a Copernican mystery or what, because it's not to do with Copernicus the man. It may or may not be to do with Copernicus the crater on the moon. I came across this 2 days ago when I was ferreting around for some other information, as you do on the internet. And I'd not seen this before, which is a bit of a surprise. But anyway, I hadn't. It's on the wiki, one of the wikis, and various other sites. I've tried to look it up. And the interesting thing is, that it's not a photograph taken live, as it were, of this particular crater, whichever crater it might be. But I'll come to that in just a moment. If you look at what it says at the bottom, photograph of the moon, calotype, made by Sir John Herschel in 1842. And then it says enigmatically, one of the earliest photographs on, and that's it. We don't know what it says underneath. This particular image is owned by the J. Paul Getty Museum, but the image is obviously not copyright. I just point out at the moment, you see there's a scale of miles on the top left there, and you see here on the side it does say Copernicus. And I thought, well, is this printed somehow onto the print, or is it drawn on? I think actually it's drawn on by somebody with a very careful hand. But the question is, who did it, who took it, and what is it? And I think there are questions about all of those things, as we shall hopefully see. The suggestion there was that he was actually produced by Sir John Herschel in 1842. I think this is probably wrong on all significant counts. John Herschel was very, very interested in photography and obviously in astronomy. But as far as I know, he never took any actual astronomical photographs through a telescope. I might be wrong. But in any case, in 1842, it just wasn't possible to do so with the photographic processes that were available at the time, and certainly not that calotype process, which I'll mention briefly in a moment. So the date of 1842 is wrong. I think the man himself, whoever authored it, was probably not John Herschel. This is what it says on the P-interest site. The moon was visible yet unreachable by keen astronomers like John Herschel in the, it says here, late 19th century. He died before the late, anyway. This photograph is actually of a detailed papier-mâché model of a moon crater, and it gives a date for late 1850s. Moon crater unknown. Well, the date is actually more likely to be correct. I'm not sure that it's correct about the papier-mâché model. It's certainly a model, but I don't think it's made of papier-mâché. And this is what it says on the J. Paul Getty Museum listing. Moon crater unknown, late 1850s. Salted paper print from a collodion negative. Well, I think this is wrong on two counts as well. I don't think it's a salted paper print, although it may well be, probably is from a collodion negative of some description. But the date is probably correct. What about that calotype aspect? Well, the calotype was invented, or almost discovered in a sense. It was an extension of the work of this chap, William Henry Fox Talbot, of Lacock Abbey in Wiltshire. And he produced something on paper. He worked on paper, producing negatives on paper. And in 1840, he discovered a process whereby you could take a much shorter exposure and then develop it, bring out the so-called latent image with chemicals. Prior to that, he'd been exposing sensitized paper into sunlight until a physically obvious and distinct image appeared just under the action of sunlight. And he realized that you didn't need to do that. And the exposures were consequently much, much shorter as a result. But as I say, I have queries about the date. I don't think that image that we've seen was taken in the 1840s at all. And I'm very skeptical that it was John Herschel. And it certainly was not Talbot, although he and Herschel were very close friends. What about the calotype itself? Here's an example of a calotype, a rather fine one taken by Hill and Adamson in Edinburgh in the mid 1840s, probably about 1845, of James Naismith, the steam hammer man, the engineer, and the astronomer. Now, he's particularly important in this particular story um, because he did indeed make models of the moon showing particular craters, which he then photographed, probably in the very early 1850s. So I think the date may well be correct, and it may be that James Naismith is the man we're after, but it's not at all certain. But just looking at this image for a moment, because it shows something of the qualities of the calotype, not the image, the kind of process which I think it might be. You can see that it has sort of broad tonality. It's a bit rough and grainy looking. That's because you're exposing through the paper of the paper negative to create another print. Now, very quickly after Talbot had announced this in 1840, it was realized that if you waxed or oiled the paper negative, you, in a sense, cut through a lot of the paper fibers in the original image, and you got a much smoother and more detailed looking picture. But even so, I don't think it's one of those. The reference to the saltpaper print was what the calotypes originally were. You produced the calotype, as I say, the latent image which was then developed, but you made the print according to the earlier process. That is, you sandwiched the negative with some sensitized paper, put it out in the sunshine, let it cook for a couple of hours, and you, what was called, you printed out positive resulted from this. You kept checking it to make sure when it got dark enough, you took it inside, took it out of the frame, fixed it, and there you were. But that's the calotype. Now, Naismith was himself a very good artist, apart from all his other talents. And I'd just like you to take note of the script that he's put here, Copernicus, which I think is very similar. You can't be at all certain unless I see the original. Very similar to the script that on the side of the purportedly Copernicus image by one James Naismith, and I don't know whether that's 1857 or 1837. It's difficult to be sure. You can't tell from this, unfortunately. He's a sort of whimsical humour, but you can see the artistry of the man. So the question is, was Naismith our man? I think he might be, but I can't prove it. Now here's an early artwork by Naismith. He built himself an enormous telescope, which, if memory serves, about 18 inches aperture. With a metal mirror, a specular metal mirror. And this is relatively early artwork that he made with his large telescope of the crater Copernicus. And he produced these plaster models. This is not the same, but again, just look at the scale here and the script, the style of lettering there. This is one of his plaster models. I don't know what area of the moon it is. And he made these, and with a chap called Carpenter, who used to be one of the astronomers at the Greenwich Observatory, they would light these from the side, a sort of glancing angle of light, and photograph them on wet collodion plates. And they were subsequently printed in a book, which I shall mention in a moment, through a very special kind of photomechanical printing process. We know that he made these models in that sort of brief period. Whether he made any after these is uncertain. Perhaps the one that we're looking at in the original, possibly Copernicus image, is a later one. We don't know. But again, I just ask you to note the scale script there, which he's using. We saw, this is Naismith's big telescope. Dave Sells, I don't think he's with us this evening, but crikey, don't I look younger? Ye gods. This is years ago when we made a small group of us made a special trip to the Science Museum, and I was very keen to have a look at Naismith's telescope, which they had there. They wouldn't let me sit on it and fiddle around with it, unfortunately, which was most annoying. But also they have in the stall there Naismith's original plaster models of bits of the moon, or at least some of them, collecting dust when we were there, but still. So they do still exist. Now in 1874, he and James Carpenter produced this book, The Moon, considered as a planet, a world and a satellite. And this contains images of the moon. And then a lot of people thought they were photographs of the moon itself, but they're not. They're photographs of very carefully sculptured plaster models. I don't know how he did it, how he and Carpenter did this, made these models, because they're lovely things. They're not tremendously 100% accurate, but they are remarkable in their own way. The book was produced in part to promote Naismith's idea of the nature of lunar craters, or the formation of the craters, because he was a volcanic man. He thought that the craters of the moon, because we didn't have anything similar on the Earth, but we do have volcanoes, he thought they were volcanic. Of course, really at the time, nobody had developed the idea of massive impacts hitting planetary bodies. So it's a not unreasonable hypothesis for the time. And here's another little bit from the book, showing another bit of the moon, Tycho, on the right-hand side, another plaster model of that area, rephotographed under side illumination to show up the textures. Now, this is an earlier image drawing done by Naismith of Copernicus. He's got the central craters pretty much right. This is, I think, with his predecessor, the smaller telescope. And I don't know whether he's done with pastels or charcoal and pastel. I don't know. Perhaps Andy knows better than me. And this is a later one which he did with a bit more detail showing, perhaps with his larger telescope. And again, this particular one, I think, is the plaster model rephotographed rather than just a drawing. Now, to get back to our original image, the question is, what does it depict? It's a crater. Well, I've already said that I don't think it's not by Herschel, it's certainly not by Talbot, possibly by Naismith one way or another, and it's not a colour type print. What about it? Well, I think the print is what's called an albumen print. What you got was a very thin piece of fine paper. You coated it with albumen, that is egg white. You sensitized it with silver salts, and you exposed it either in a camera or, more likely, use it to expose underneath a negative, either collodion or perhaps a paper negative, to produce a positive print. And you can tell that if you look at this fading around the edges, that's very characteristic of albumen prints, because they were quite prone to fading, certainly in an industrial atmosphere which contained sulfurous, noxious sulfurous gases. But often the egg white itself contained residual sulfur, and it tended to attack and make the image fade over time. But 1842, color type, John Herschel, definitely not. I'm pretty sure. Albumen prints were available from the late 1840s, so a relatively early 1850s date would fit with our time scale. I did actually come across one other chap who produced plaster models of lunar craters who I'd not heard of before, and this is Henry Blunt. He's an artist astronomer in Shropshire, in Shrewsbury to be precise. Had quite a short life, 1806 to 1853. And he was a talented artist, worked particularly in watercolours. Here's one of a bit of Shrewsbury itself. And there was a meeting of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, I think in 1849, see a date here, in Shrewsbury. He produced two of these images, models, plaster models of the crater Eratosthenes, which is not very far from Copernicus, as you know, on the lunar surface. And he made one in 1848 and then presented another one to the British Association when they met in Shrewsbury in 1849, and that's this one which they still have. And here it is blown up, his model of Eratosthenes, not particularly detailed. I don't know what telescope he was using. He was saying there that it was 250 times magnification. Seems quite a lot to me, but I don't know. And this is Eratosthenes crater itself from a modern image. Go back to that one. You can see that Blunt's image is not wonderfully detailed, but is a nice try. Now, Talbot himself did take an image of the moon, and I know nothing about this image except that it was taken in 1864. I don't know what process he used, although the ragged looking outlines make it look as though it was possibly a paper negative, and obviously it's a paper print, but that's all I know about it. But nothing like zeroing in on any particular crater, as you can see. Now, this is a modern image of Copernicus, and you can see that Naismith, he wasn't at all bad. He's fairly accurate in his depiction on his model of the central peak area. And here's the model, and here's that image again. I turned the image around to roughly compare with the angle of illumination, because it could be the other way around, 180 degrees around the other way. And you can see that the central peaks are not particularly accurate. And we've seen before that Naismith's central peaks were quite accurate. So that makes me think that if Naismith made this, which he may well have done, perhaps it's not the crater Copernicus at all, despite its attribution by other personages. Could it possibly be the crater Tycho? If it is, then obviously Tycho's visible to us at a certain angle, so you would have to have rectified it on his plaster model. But I don't think that would be much of a problem for Naismith. So here's Tycho, and here's that image again of the unknown crater, and I think that's a closer fit. It's not spot on, but I think it's a closer fit than calling it an image of Copernicus. You can see a little crater there, and there's one there. I don't know. It may, of course, not be in any actual particular crater. It may be a sort of generic crater. That is another possibility. But it's just something which I came across only 2 days ago, and I thought, well, you don't know what's going to come up next, do you? I might pursue this with the Getty Museum themselves, if I can get a reply from them, to see what they actually make of it themselves. But anyway, I thought I'd just present that to you, and if anybody has any clues, do please let me know. So I shall now stop sharing my screen. There we are.
Can I ask a question, Ray?
Yeah?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Super talk. That was fascinating. I really enjoyed that. You know, the original thing that you showed had the date 1842.
Yeah.
And the date suddenly became the 1850s or maybe even later.
Yeah.
So was that 1842 date a simple mistake, an inspired guess, or do you think somebody was trying to give it more kudos? Because the earlier the date, the more perhaps kudos your photograph might have.
Well, I think it was certainly a mistake, possibly by somebody who didn't know enough about the early history of astronomical photography or early history of photographic processes. It's written on in pencil, and I'd like to know what's cropped off, because there's a bit of wording which we don't see, which may or may not help the case. But it looks as though at some point the Getty Museum catalogued it possibly correctly, at least as far as date is concerned. But they, I think they were right about it being a collodion negative. I think it's an albumen print, not a salt print. Although salt did come into the albumen process, so it's a bit difficult to be sure. Yeah.
Just before I shut up, you get the same problem with biblical manuscripts. There's always the word that you actually want is always deleted.
Yeah.
Somebody's torn it out, you know. That's the one that will sort of answer all the questions. And there's been a few examples where ancient manuscripts have got crucial bits of information missing.
Well, it's one of these things where it's sort of half correct. When the Getty Museum catalogue say it was a salted paper print, the salted paper print was Talbot's original process, which did involve combining silver nitrate with sodium chloride, salt. But the albumen process also used sodium chloride, to provide the light-sensitive silver compound. So they were not altogether wrong. It's just that they were not altogether right.
Oh, sorry, where can you see that image now then?
Well,
apart from the internet.
Yeah, if you look it up on Wikipedia, I think if you just put up John Herschel actually on Wikipedia.
Yeah. No, I meant where actually is it? Where is
I
it?
think the Getty
Oh,
Museum.
right, yeah.
Yeah, but it's not, because it's old and etc. It's not copyrighted.
Yeah,
Um, so
thank you.
yeah, so I may well tackle them, see if I can get anything out of them. Yeah.
Thank you.
Ray,
Yeah.
it's quite an interesting little piece that. Obviously, I'm interested. When you were saying that, is it Tycho, is it Copernicus, and then you sort of took the image of uh, the the actual mystery photograph, and then twizzled it round a bit and compared it with a modern day photograph from the lunar orbiter or whatever. And you said, oh yeah, this ties in a bit more closely with Tycho than Copernicus because there's that little crater there and what have you. That's what I tend to try and do with my drawing stuff. I'm usually armed with a magnifying glass, one a big sort of moon chart of Patrick Moore's, which are very detailed. So you need a magnifying glass unless you've got supervision. And I tend to do that. I tend to say, well, I've from what I've drawn without reference to anything, this is what I've drawn. That crater there seems to correspond with that on that lunar map or on that photograph. But it takes hours because I have to do in order to get it sort of clear in my mind that my drawing is reasonably accurate. You have to do lots and lots of different cross-referencing bits that look as if they tally or coincide what you've drawn with what's actually on photographic images and other maps. And it takes a long time to do. But just a sort of very quick glance at what you showed, that last image where you compared the two, it does look not exactly the same as the photographic image, but fairly close match, I would say. But you need to look at it at many features and see if they all tie up.
Yeah, it's closer. When you do your drawings, do you use a grid at all to help you get the features in the right places?
No, I don't know, because perhaps I should start doing that if I'm sort of serious about getting these things more and more accurate. Yeah, that is a good idea, but I'd have to get the gridded paper beforehand.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult to do it that accurately from a telescope where you've got a piece of paper at the side of you. The telescope, the image is moving all the time, especially if you've got it if you're looking through a high-powered eyepiece. It's very difficult to do.
Yeah, is the telescope not driven then? Is it?
No, it's totally manual.
Yeah.
Just did I notice, by the way, on one of the pictures, the one of Tycho, there was a small crater at the top left which seemed to match exactly the drawing that showed which claimed to be the other crater.
Yeah.
Am I mistaken there? There seemed to be an exact match as well as the one that you pointed out.
Yeah, it may be. It's an oddity because if it was by Naismith, you would expect it to be really well known, and it's not one of those that he used in that book, the 1874 book. So, and he died in, I think, 1881. So it's a puzzle. It may not be him at all.
And the other thing was that you showed a picture that appeared to have been done with some kind of, by Naismith, with some kind of drawing equipment, and it looked to me, you sort of said, well, I'm not sure, but it did look to me like charcoal and what do you call it, pastel, pastel shade, because of the white highlights. You would have had pastels and charcoal at that time. And it was a very nice drawing, I have to say.
Yeah, I thought it was fascinating how they, seem to get the heights of the craters and the mountains pretty well. I guess they, maybe shine the light at the same angle and try to do a trial and error based on drawings or something to and get the shadows right, with the light at the right angle. I don't know how they would have done that.
Yeah, I suspect that the plaster models, actually, when we saw them, the couple that we saw in the Science Museum, I was a bit surprised at how flat the terrain looked. But that was probably realistic, actually, because the craters and etc. are not particularly deep compared to the dimensions of the moon itself. And it's obvious they look dramatic because they're side lit. We only see them as dramatic when they're near the terminator, of course. Um, I don't doubt Naismith was fully aware of the actual dimensions, heights of the craters and the mountains, etc. How much he tried to be accurate in his models. I don't know how he sculpted all that plaster work. I really don't. He doesn't say, as far as I know.
Well, there
Yeah,
again, I mean, the guy was a trained engineer. He had all the right skill sets for doing incredibly detailed and accurate draftsmanship. Really, so I admire that guy. I mean, the stuff that he did was brilliant.
I don't know. I mean, time to go. I don't know whether the plaster models look as if they were sort of molded while the plaster was still plastic or semi-fluid, as it were, rather than allowed to set and then ground away at it, for want of a better expression, sculpted out. But I don't know.
I was going to ask how he managed to translate the image into a plaster model. I'd love to know what technique he used.
I don't know. The only thing which I didn't know until we saw them in the Science Museum was that because obviously the lunar surface is curved, so to try to get the best effect, he actually used curved wood. And it was like barrel staves, sort of tongue grooved together, but on a very gentle curve. Can't do it on this thing to try to get that proper curve into the lunar surface. So he was conscientious about it, certainly.
Great talk, by the way, and I see it's been given from your new observatory.
Oh yeah, that's good, isn't it?
in your attic.
Why do you need 3 umbrellas?
I need a philosopher's hat to go with it. Yeah.
Great new Skywatcher refractor you've got in the middle.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yes, go on.
Anyone else got any? Oh, I got another question for you, Ray. Did they have, for these color types, did they have fixers of any sort, like sodium hypochlorite?
Yes, they did. The original
Thiosulfate.
The original way that Fox Talbot, or William Henry Fox Talbot, used to fix the image, we wouldn't call fixing, we would call it stabilizing, whereby he realized that if he had an excess of sodium chloride, salt, he couldn't produce an image. So he hit on the idea of actually putting the finished image, the visible image this was, into a bath of hot salt solution. It might fix the thing, so it wouldn't be any more sensitive to light any longer, which does work. And there are some images still available, they're 150 years old, more. But it's not very good. It was in about the same time that he announced the calotype, perhaps 1841, I can't remember exactly, when John Herschel put him on to hyposulfite of soda, as they called it then, sodium thiosulfate, as we call it now. And it was shortened to the name hypo, which is the name that carried on into photography for 150 odd years, hypo. But yes, that's what he and everybody else used subsequently, although some mad people in the wet collodion era had a penchant for using potassium cyanide as a fixer. I don't know why, and I don't know how many didn't survive the process, but apparently it worked. But hypo is safer. Yes.
And do these original photographs exist now, or have they all gone black?
No, some of them do still exist. they used to, when people first tried doing photographs or photographic images, of course, they remain sensitive to light, so that if you showed them to people in daylight, they would go darker and darker, not lighter and lighter, but darker and darker. So they used to put things into what they call a night album, whereby they would bring them out only at night, and they show them to people by candlelight, which didn't affect, because it's quite reddish, it didn't affect the blue sensitive silver chemistry. But yeah, there's an awful lot of images left, certainly from the 1839-40 period onwards. The rival process, which was announced first, was the daguerreotype, which was done on a silver metal plate, and literally probably tens of millions of those were produced between 1840 and 1860 odd, mostly portraits. And I don't know how many tens of thousands of those still exist, but plenty, yeah.
Mm. Thanks very much. Okay, well, if nobody else has got any questions, I suggest we have our break now. Quick 10 minutes maybe to have a stretch and make a cup of tea.
Can I just jump in with one little quickie?
Yeah.
You mentioned potassium cyanide being used as a fixative. Sodium thiosulfate, i.e. hypo, is used as in medicine, is used as an antidote to cyanide poisoning.
Oh, you really? I didn't know that. I have to remember that.
It struck a nerve with me, so I've just looked it up, and it's true.
Could come in handy, yes.
I was about to ask how you'd figure what use you had for that now that you've retired.
What they call a quick fix.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Probably safer to stick to stamp collecting.
Yeah.
Right.